much I love to hang out and chat. We probably should start. So my name is Amy Janess. I'm programming coordinator for the Nantucket Atheneum, which is the public library on Nantucket Island. I want to welcome everyone for coming. And I'm just gonna, let's see, before I do the introduction, I'd like to say, as we go along, if you have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat or the Q&A. You'll find those little icons at the bottom of your screen, and we'll let those pile up. And then towards the end of the program, Kate will answer questions. This program is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel. If you search YouTube for Nantucket Atheneum, you'll see we have a whole bunch of great stuff there. So if you know anybody who couldn't join us tonight, but is interested in the program, please send them to our YouTube channel. And I'm just going to say a few, oh, there we go.
Sorry.
And so I'd just like to tell you a little bit about Kate, and then we'll start. So Kate Winkler Dawson is an author, educator, documentary filmmaker, and podcaster. Her books include American Sherlock and Death in the Air, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, WCBS News, ABC News Radio, PBS NewsHour, and Nightline. Her true crime podcast, Tenfold More Wicked, can be found on the Exactly Right Network, and she teaches journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. And she's joined tonight in conversation with Janet Forrest. Janet is a program coordinator at the Nantucket Atheneum, where she plans and executes events. She's also the proprietor of Coaching by Janet Forrest, where she offers clients motivational life coaching. So please join me in welcoming Kate and Janet, and for what I'm sure is going to be a great conversation.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Amy. I've been looking forward to this all summer, all spring, really. And
it's been a long year, hasn't it?
It's been a long year, right? And for everyone here, I first heard of Kate Winkler Dawson through her podcast that I listened to, Tenfold More Wicked, and then it just led to a book and then another book, and I've just gone down the rabbit hole, and I'm very excited to have you here. But we're going to start with her most recent book that's now in paperback, and you can get it at local bookstores here, American Sherlock Holmes. And I wanted to start by telling you kind of stumbled into this story in an odd way, and it almost didn't happen, I believe. So can you talk a little bit about how you got started on this story?
Sure. Actually, I'll let me see if I can find my book. I like to have a visual. Hang on. So after my first book, which was called Death in the Air, and Death in the Air, as Janet was mentioning, Death in the Air was about one really big event, which was the Great London Smog of 1952, and it had real people in it. So the characters I had was like a little girl who lost her father, and a doctor and a police officer and a serial killer. So that was one large event told through the lens of multiple people. And I knew for the second book that I really wanted to try to do the opposite of that. I was hoping to find one person, one lens to tell multiple stories through. So my father was a law professor at the University of Texas for 37 years before he died in 2005. And he was one of the co-founders of the Innocence Project at UT. And so I had always had this interest in forensics. So I was pretty desperate to find my next book, book number 2. I was really desperate to find a good forensic scientist, but I just didn't really know where to look. And I'm always on the lookout for new stories, especially with the podcast. I'm always on the lookout for really good historical true crime stories. And so I bought this book. It's kind of embarrassing, but I bought this book, and I'll show it to you guys. It's by Robert Nash, and it's called Blood Letters and Bad Men. And it's essentially an encyclopedia of murder that in America that starts from the Mayflower, because there was a killer on the Mayflower, and all the way through to the 1970s when this book was published, which is perfect for me because I don't like anything any more contemporary than maybe the 1950s. The older, the better for me. And so I was on page 100-ish, and I had just dug my way through these poisoners in the 1800s and these gangsters in the 1920s. And in 1923, there was a huge, epic what they called America's last great train robbery. And we could talk about that case later if we want, but in it, I read the moniker America's Sherlock Holmes because Edward Oscar Heinrich, who would become the subject of the book, was someone who could take a pair of overalls that federal agents had literally combed over to try to find clues, and it came up empty, and he found 20 to 30 clues just on one pair of overalls. And so then I think what you're talking about really is, I said, the next thing I do when I'm trying to find a book is, when I'm on a lead, like, okay, this guy Heinrich is great, I think I'm going to try to write a book about him. The next thing you would do as a writer is figure out what your sources are. So what's your archive like? And for me, the kind of books I write they're novelistic, they're all nonfiction, but they're narrative nonfiction. So I have to have a lot of details, which means I really need letters, journals, I need ephemera, I need eyeglasses and bullets and everything that I can put my hands on. And I found that Oscar Heinrich has an archive at the University of California at Berkeley, but it was closed, which means it's not open to researchers. And Berkeley has a way that you could kind of petition and say, why should we catalog this collection that's been sitting in our archive for 65 years? And it was huge, which was the reason why nobody had touched it. It was more than 100 boxes. And I don't think people were quite clear on why he was important. So I told them why he's important. He was a pioneer in forensics, probably one of the greatest forensic scientists ever. He solved these incredible cases between 1910 as one of the first professional forensic scientists in the country until he died in 1953. He covered more than 2,000 criminal cases. So when I said all this, the archivist's assistant said, good luck. We're not going to be able to do anything with this collection. It's way too big. We are, sadly, as I know a lot of libraries know, we're underfunded, and we're not going to be able to do this. And then I appealed to the head archivist, who then finally said, okay, you're right, and I will do this, and it's going to take 2 years, but I will do it 1 day a week. And then really when it came down to it, I was bumping up on my deadline, and I said, I really need to get in and see his case files. And so she invited me to the warehouse, which is sort of the holding home for all archive collections. So Oscar's son, I think, pulled up, I don't know if U-Hauls were invented in the 60s, but he pulled up a U-Haul to Berkeley steps and dumped out all of Oscar's case files for 40 or 50 years. And, they literally boxed him up and put him in this warehouse for 65 years. And so, when they were digging into it, they were trying to catalog it, put numbers on the boxes. And I was sort of trying to pressure the archivist and said, I have a deadline. I need to get in this. And she said, okay, well, you're just going to have to come to the warehouse. So they had never had anybody do that before. I sat next to her. She was telling me to pull down this box, and I would pull down the box and look through all the stuff, and we would just talk about all the cases. So yeah, if it weren't for Laura Michaels at UC Berkeley, there's no way the book would have ever been written. I have loved archivists before, but Laura really takes the cake on this. So I was grateful for her.
Yeah, and what I liked about both books is you really dig it. It's true. You feel like you're there. It's written like a novel, and it has to come from letters and journal and tracking it all down. And I guess, I don't know, that just seems so overwhelming. So how do you stay sane, and how do you make your decisions of what goes in and what stays out?
I think you kind of just get a gut. If you're if you're somebody who really enjoys storytelling, and I do, I think you just get a gut for things. So a gut feel for things. So my first book, I was just telling somebody this story. My first book, Death in the Air, as I said, it's about a smog and a little girl who, actually she was 12, so not a little girl, but she was 12, and she was, her father was struggling to get home from the smog, and he's dying, and it's sort of her trials and tribulations, but she's just one character, right? The book really is also about a serial killer. So a friend of mine, Skip Hollingsworth, who's an incredible writer, a great true crime writer for Texas Monthly Magazine, he read the book, and he called me because we were getting ready to do a joint presentation together. And he called me and he said, you wrote a book about a serial killer, but your prologue is all about some kid crawling around in a blitzed house right after World War II, playing hide and go seek. how could you not start with the serial killer? And I said that is because this girl is the only reason you're really going to want to get to the end of my book. Everybody else is kind of miserable. You know, the serial killer, we know he's probably going to get executed, but this kid didn't do anything. She didn't cause the smog. She didn't smoke like a lot of the people who died during the smog did. She wasn't in the government. She didn't buy coal. She wasn't a sex worker involved with the serial killer. I mean, there's a whole slew of things. And this kid is the only innocent thing in the whole book. So I want to start with her so that you want to know what happens to her by the end of the book. So I think it's keeping those kinds of things in mind is hard because you're always trying to do this, like in filmmaking, when I teach students filmmaking, we talk about the narrative arc, right? So, you're starting at the beginning and you're teaching students how to recognize the strength in characters, how to pull people in, how to make audiences have an investment. Why should I care about Rosemary Merritt? Why do I care about this girl? And then, the tension, well, what ends up happening? And then coming down what the aftermath is. And I think that is always the struggle for me, is making sure that with a book like this, American Sherlock, where I've got multiple cases and this man's life story, I have to keep an eye on so many different arcs. There's the overall arc of the book, where he starts and where he ends. There's the arc in each little case. There's like 7 or 8 cases. And then there's the arc of his personal life, and then the arc of where he starts in forensics and where he ends in forensics. So it was an awful lot to keep up with. It was, but I think, especially after I did Death in the Air, moving on to American Sherlock, I understood narrative structure a lot better. And it was something that it came a little more naturally. And I'm just literally wrapping up my 3rd book, literally in the next 6 weeks. And it's been the same thing. It's hard. You get to a point, for me, for this last book that I've been writing, I'm on, it's only 8 chapters, and I'm on chapter 6, almost at 7. And I'm at a point where I have forgotten what I even wrote at the beginning of the book. I mean, I can't remember. And at some point I have to stop and just go back and start revising, because I think you can lose your focus. I hate using cliches, but you absolutely, you can't find the forest from the trees. You get so stuck in it. So it's a challenge. It is.
As I was reading American Sherlock, I called it the wrong title. Sorry. American Sherlock. What was interesting is you have this guy who's on the cutting edge of CSI, basically inventing CSI. And now when you watch TV, it's all CSI. That's what everyone wants, DNA and like other things. Mm-hmm. But at the time, he was getting a lot of pushback, not just from police, but also his colleagues. And there was a lot of questioning around science. And we're seeing that again today in different ways. And I don't know, how do you see a parallel in any way of like how he kind of stood by his science and his research and got a lot of pushback in what you see in the news today and in our culture today?
Yeah, I think that new things are scary. And he was encountering an awful lot of prosecutors and police who had been used to doing things one way, and they thought it was very effective. They did not think that the science was reliable. I think, Oscar would present in court these massive photos of boulders, and nobody understood until he really started talking that they weren't boulders, they were grains of sand. And he was talking about forensic geology. So all of this, to a lot of judges and prosecutors and police and certainly juries, was a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo until he got results. And where his results came was that case that we were talking about, 1923, the Siskiyou train robbery. Because he did get some really interesting results. He was able, a couple of years earlier, he was able to predict, he was able to profile a killer and predict accurately what the man's job was. He was just a really unique investigator. But when that Siskiyou train robbery happened, and he was able to pull a profile and discover evidence that nobody had even seen off of this pair of overalls, I think that's really when the narrative changed for him, when he was really seeing results. And maybe, that kind of is unfortunately what in some ways might happen now, is when you start seeing the science that is right, then we see the results. However, Oscar was not always right. And I've read many letters. I've read probably about close to 2,000 of his letters. He had a lot of, the people who was writing with were also very well known. So they kept his letters in their archives. So I was in a pretty unique position where I was able to actually synthesize conversations. So it reads like a novel, like I made up all of this stuff, but it's really letters that I could just literally put together and, talk back. They would talk back and forth, particularly with his reference librarian. And Oscar had so many cases, not once did I ever read him a note from him saying, I think I was wrong, or I want to go back and look at this again. That's a problem. That's a big problem for a forensic scientist to not realize that he's fallible. And the science in this case, some of it was incredibly valid and some of it wasn't. So, I think it's always a struggle at the beginning of any new discovery, scientific discovery. You think we're right. And then we find out, well, we need to do some revision. And we see that now, obviously, with what's happening with COVID. There's this sort of like, what's the CD saying? What's happening? What's going on? I think it's just a growing pain, particularly in Oscar's case, where he was really convinced that a lot of this stuff was right, and he was right, but there were some things that he needed to work out a little bit better.
Yeah. What do you think would be different if he had received a little less pushback and a little bit more acceptance? And he was, if I remember correctly, he was sabotaged a little bit by his colleagues.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was very competitive. These were all guys who were hired. They were competing for spots on the stand, essentially.
Yeah. And if he had gotten less pushback, do you think he would have maybe been a little less arrogant? You spent a lot of time with him, or that's how he was wired?
I think he would have been more arrogant. I think he, I think that Oscar had to think very highly of himself in order to be in this position that he's in. And I think he had to have that confidence. And I think that the arrogance that he showed, it's hard. Somebody asked me the other day if I liked him, Oscar Heinrich, and, would I like him as a person? Would I want to hang out with him? In small doses, I think. But I think from an interest level, maybe like a sociology level, I think it would be fascinating. But as a person, I think he was very rigid and very stringent. And I think that the more success he had and the more money he could charge, just sort of the bigger his ego got. But he also got results. So it's sort of hard to argue with sometimes.
The podcast and the books are about true crime, and I've kind of less secretly now, I find true crime fascinating, and I think a lot of people do. It's hard to look away.
Right.
And it becomes this, but I also feel a certain level of ambivalence about it. And am I reading this and am I exploiting the worst possible thing that could happen to a person and their family? Or am I learning from it? And I was wondering what questions you ask yourself and what ethics you follow as you kind of navigate and tread those waters of what you write and what you don't write. And I don't know, I guess.
Well, I think that that's a really good question. It's something I've been talking about as I've looked forward to other projects, other book projects, especially is particularly being a woman who writes about true crime. I always put this caveat in that it's historical true crime that I write about. And I think I say that because I'm very uncomfortable as a journalist covering contemporary true crime. And I'm sorry if any of you in the audience write true crime for the modern day or do podcasts. It makes me uncomfortable because I don't like dealing with live people a lot. I prefer them dead. And I think I really prefer, I feel like the further back I can go, the more perspective I can have while still having the intimacy of the situation. I also am very picky about time periods when I do in locations. So I have to go through kind of a long list of things. It was difficult for me to do the story on John Reginald Christie from Death in the Air because he did sexually assault the women. I feel like in that book I handled it about as well as anybody could have handled it, to be honest, because it was, I was really trying to explain the terror that these women felt without exploiting them, which is so easy to do. So easy to do. And one point that I make an awful lot in David Lamson, the story of David Lamson, in American Sherlock, David Lamson was a kind of executive at a Stanford University Press, and he was married to a lovely woman named Aileen Lamson. And one morning in 1933, he goes out to work in his backyard and she's taking a bath and he walks back in and she's dead and there's blood on every wall. And he is quickly under arrest for murder. And one of the points that I wanted to make, and I did a very similar point in Death in the Air, is with Aileen Lamson, I saw the crime scene photo. And of course, she has no clothes on. She's in the bath. She's slumped over, her blonde hair is everywhere. There is blood all over the ground. It's a terrible photo. And my feeling about what was happening that day with the police was, my impression was that it was mostly male police officers who were there. So if you picture that scene, this woman, when I read the notes, had been in that bath. Her body had been laying there for, I think they said 5 to 6 hours before they finally, put her body on a gurney and wheeled her out. So here you have this naked woman, completely vulnerable in warm bath water that's now red. It's just a terrible scene. And then we have, her diary that was published. I mean, these are all things that ironically are in my book. But what I am saying, quite honestly, is she would have been horrified. She would have never wanted somebody reading her diary. There's nothing bad in her diary, but these are all things that I consider. And what I think about with historical true crime, what I try to do is, I think true crime shines a light on issues within society that sometimes we just don't want to address. And I think that true crime is an excellent way. It's an excellent for me, like an excellent structure for a narrative, right? So there are usually interesting people, either victims or the killers or the police. They're strong characters. Then something happens and then someone is changed by the end of your story. And that doesn't happen all the time. And it's sort of like sports. You've got a sports team and, you set the stakes early. Billy's team, they're all on scholarship. If they lose, they're not going to be able to return to college. Well, now I don't care about baseball, but I want to see if Billy's team loses or wins because I understand what it feels like to not win. And I think true crime is very similar for me, but it's really tricky, which is why I say I like to go really, really far back. The first book was 1952. Sherlock was 1920-ish. And the third book, which is about the podcast Edward Ruloff, was 1873. And then the fourth book is going to be 1822. So it's like pretty much I'll be back in Greek times the way I'm going.
Yeah, I noticed that it's particularly the Body Snatchers, that season of Tenfold More Wicked about Burke and Hare, and they are very much characters. And I reminded myself, oh, these are people, and this happened. It was a really awful thing. Yeah. But what I found fascinating, what you did there was you brought to modern times by talking about how Edinburgh, in particular, and many places now so for people listening, it's about they weren't body snatchers, they actually murdered people, and the purpose was to sell them to this doctor, and it really created a conversation for Scotland about what are you allowed to do with your body, and they're very strict with the rules there, and it's a good looking back in history and learning from that of why it's important and why we value that. Yeah. But when you're listening to the story, it does feel like Jekyll and Hyde, and it feels like a novel. And I don't know, it's just very interesting. And it seems like I don't know what your yardstick is, but it reaches a point like Jack the Ripper did terrible things, but he's sort of this mythical creature.
Right.
And then you think of, Harvey Weinstein in 60 years, is he going to be a Jack the Ripper, or is he still going to be the monster we think he is today?
Right. Like, well, I'll give you an example. One of the things, I have a fantastic editor at Penguin Random House. And one of the things that she always asks me is, why are we telling this story now? And that's what I feel like I wish more true crime books could do. So why do I care about the story now? Well, Death in the Air, we care about that story because of its air pollution then. It was a corrupt government and an apathetic government that caused up 20,000 deaths from air pollution and continued year after year. Why do we care about American Sherlock? Well, forensics is problematic now, and there are people in jail in Texas because a dog sniffed them and identified. That's the only proof that they were identified as a suspect. So we need to work on that. So an example for me, I always think like, well, why do contemporary audiences care about a story from the 1800s? And I was looking into a story about a woman who was in the 1860s who was wrongfully kind of incarcerated in Utica's lunatic asylum, state lunatic asylum. Probably most people know this, that in the 1800s and a large part of the 1900s, a woman could be admitted unlawfully many times by men. This happened to be her mother and her sisters put her in this asylum, and she came out and wrote a scathing memoir about it. And, she's forced to take medicine that she doesn't want to take. And, she's made to work and then not work and told what to do. She's just told what to do. And then I was thinking to myself, this Britney Spears stuff with the conservatorship drives me insane. And that this happens. And it happens more with women. It certainly happens with elderly people, but that is sort of what the conversations I'm hearing within the publishing world and in the journalism world is the instances of this happening with women. So this is something that happened with this woman 150 years ago that still resonates, with modern day audiences. So it's all, I don't know if it's cyclical or what the right word is, but I can relate to, for Tenfold, I just covered a story from 1766, and I completely understand every character in that episode, in that season. I understand every position that they're in and why they're there, and I relate to them, and I understand the emotions in their writing. So we can learn so much from these stories. And for me, I just happen to be more comfortable telling stories from a little bit more of a distance, where I spent a lot of time as a journalist knocking on doors and saying, how do you feel about this terrible tragedy? And I just don't really want to do with that anymore.
Well, and I think the distance and time allows just everyone to be a little more detached and look at it with more objectivity. Right now I'm watching, it came out a while ago, but I'm watching The Keepers, the docuseries.
Oh yeah.
Baltimore. And I was raised Catholic. My parents went to school with nuns, and they're about that age, and I'm finding it hard. I'm watching an episode, taking a break, and I think it's an important story, and I'm finding it very interesting, but I'm finding it really hard to, digest. And I think when you go back 100 years or 150 years, you get the stories and the context and the lessons, but it's a little bit easier to digest.
Yeah, my daughter, I mentioned to you much earlier, my daughters are 11 and a half, and one of them really is into mysteries. Like we watched And Then There Were None, Agatha Christie. She wants to read it now. She saw the BBC series. For an 11-year-old, she's pretty advanced with crime. She loves writing about crime. And she told me that when I let her watch a couple of documentaries that were probably parenting fails on my part on Netflix. They were not too bloody, but one actually, Tread. I don't know if you guys have seen Tread yet, but it is an unbelievable documentary about on Netflix about a man who feels like he's been completely for lack of a better word, screwed over by his town in Colorado, and he builds a bulldozer that is a tank essentially and mows down every building of every person who's ever made him mad. It's really an interesting film. But she told me she does not want to see anything related to that has happened in the past as long as she's been alive. So she doesn't want to know anything. I think for her, anything earlier than 2009 is game, but anything, sooner than that, since she's been alive, is too real for her. And I might feel like that too. I don't know. Like I said, even the 1950s with John Reginald Christie, the serial killer, I definitely felt it more, the fear more than with American Sherlock. Even that 30-year difference made a difference to me.
Yeah. There's a book I thought, I'm not going to remember the name, but if I can, it was about a similar, it was a true crime book by a woman, and she writes about the original house, almost like dinner party murder. And it's a little girl that's murdered. It happens in this big house in England. And at the time, Dickens was a contemporary and Wilkie Collins was a contemporary, and they were all following this murder case. And it was the rise and fall of a detective. It's something like that. But at the end of the book, she writes about how we love detective stories, and we get to the end and there's we find out who did it, and they're tied up with a bow, having forgotten that someone died. And we often get to the end and forget the victim. And I don't know. What are your thoughts on, and you said that with the little girl, like remembering the life and the people and the victims, not just the big personalities of these serial killers.
Well, I was just talking to a friend of mine about a researcher about this, because, my job is generally to write about men killing women. It's just what happens in true crime. And actually, I'm sure, Janet, you will be interested in hearing this, I have my first female killer for Tenfold More Wicked, which starts in January. Season 4 will feature a woman, thank goodness. Unfortunately, she kills another woman, but we're getting there. I'm getting somewhere where it's not just men killing women, but that is true crime. Predominantly, right? So my challenge has been in both of these books, and in the third book too, to make the characters, to have enough details about these women, these characters, whether they're victims or whether they're, family members, to have enough of an interesting amount of details about them so they can stand up to the killer. Because it's really hard to compete with a killer, especially somebody like John Reginald Christie for my first book. So I work really hard at that. I might have noticed in the David Lamson chapter in American Sherlock, I start one of the chapters with his daughter, who was very small, BB. She was very tiny at the time. And I had to write it from her point of view, which is, I know from photos and from interviews with her grandmother, the contemporary interviews with her grandmother, I know what she was saying and where she was looking, and her father's getting ready to go on trial for murdering her mother. And I was just really trying in all of these stories to find the strong woman, even if she was dead. And I just don't feel like you have a choice, because otherwise then women just become props. That's what happens. There's a body count. And what was difficult with the Burke and Hare, you're talking about the serial killers in Edinburgh in the 1800s who killed 17 people so they could sell their bodies to an anatomy professor. A couple of women are the ones who tripped them up. And I like to make that point. I think it's really, really important in this genre that we really do keep an eye on that. And a book that I'm proposing that I find really interesting is about religion, a man killing a woman, not far off from The Keepers, that happens in the 1800s in New England. But there's a true crime writer who is writing in the 1822, true crime writer, who's writing about this. And she's a very affluent woman. And she writes a book that is scathing of the man who was the killer. just decimates his character, and it had never been written before. That type of what I call advocacy journalism, which is what I try to do in my books, it just hadn't been written. So this is someone who influenced me without me even knowing it, from 100 and something years ago, almost 200 years ago. So it's pretty incredible that there have always been writers, and particularly female writers. There have always been the gross ones who write about gross things and exploit victims and don't care what the families feel and don't talk to the families. And then there are people who I hope to be, which are the ones who are trying to show respect towards the families. And it's difficult. Again, that's why the older the better for me. I really like older cases.
I have one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience.
Sure.
I was wondering, so you started as a reporter, and then you've written a couple books, and then I think you're newest to podcasting, and you've done some television. And I was just wondering, is there a way that you need to change your storytelling or your technique or your research based on whether it's a book or a podcast or for video or film?
It's so interesting. Actually, podcasting changed quite a bit for me and how I research books. For American Sherlock and for Death in the Air, which both came before podcasting, I never looked for family members because these stories are so old. It's never been a priority to find a family member because most of them didn't have, if they had them, they were like third cousins removed, and with the podcast, that's my big priority, is finding family members. What happens in the podcast, I think a good example is season 3, Howard Pearson. What happens is, I do a story on a really big family, something that happens in a big family. And the Pearson family, this was a young man who killed his parents. One was an associate Supreme Court judge of Texas, very well known in 1935. It actually happened right down around the corner from me. And they were trying to figure out, the whole family has for decades been trying to figure out why that happened. And there were a lot of different reasons, I think. And so the point of that podcast is I reach out to as many family members as I can. I tell them I'm interested in doing this story, and they always want to know why. And I say, because I want to know what really happened. Gray Pearson, who was one of the first people I spoke to, Gray Pearson had some hypotheses and some ideas and some information. Some of it was right, some of it was not. And then as I kind of drilled down, I got to the people who actually had known the killer, who knew the real reasons. So it started from Gray Pearson, one of the other family members saying, Howard had schizophrenia and he just became violent, and that's why he ended up in a asylum. And it drilled all the way down to, well, actually his dad was abusive, and actually, he was fine. So there's a lot of misinformation within families. And I really like pulling it together and then kind of saying, okay, well, this is what I figured out, and I think the truth is in here. And it always surprises people. So what changed for me is with these next books these next projects I'm looking at, now families have been the priority for me, finding those families, because they just add a lot of information and depth that I just would never even come close to having. So it's interesting what it's taught me.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I imagine even if they have the wrong information, you're getting their perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's more interesting than you speculating. It's having a separate person speculate and why they got to that, the reasons or the perspective they got to.
That's right.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm going to go to some questions. Jay says, delightful crime, blood, etc. Question, hope you'll go into the murder on the Mayflower a bit. Or
Jay.
The colonizer? I'm not familiar with that.
No, not a colonizer. So hold on, let me see. Because I had just read this. Where was it? The Mayflower. It was not a domestic, it sounded like a love triangle is what I remember. It might not be able to run into it right now, but it was a pretty, Yeah, a narrative encyclopedia of American criminals from the Pilgrims to the present. So I'll have to look and see. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was an interesting little story. It wasn't just a terrible person doing what they did in general. This was an extraordinary, this was a true crime also. You know, your stereotypical true crime. I think it was a love triangle.
Jay has another question, and everyone else go ahead and put in the chat or the Q&A. He wanted to ask, you talked about how he predicted the killer's job, and do you mind going into that on how he did it?
Yeah, so, you know, the thing that's interesting to me about that story is it was the murder, well, it was a kidnapping and the murder of a Catholic priest. And in Colma, California in 1921. And there was a ransom note that Heinrich, at this point in his career, it was 1921, so he's about 10 years into his career, which seems like a long time, but in the world of forensics, it really wasn't. He was hired as not second chair, but third chair, which really ticked him off. He had two kind of old men working above him, and he thought they were both quacks, and they didn't like him either. So when they had this ransom note, they used graphology. So graphology was looking at the lettering and saying if Janet doesn't close the end of her O, then something, she has insomnia or she's a sex addict or something. I mean, really, really trying to connect your personality with your writing. And so that's what these guys did. They said, well, he looks crazy. Well, that's not helpful at all. They couldn't give any information. So Oscar looked at the lettering, and part of it was typed and part of it was cursive. And he said, he told the cop, I don't know who this guy is. I can't identify him right now, but I can tell you what his job is. At one point, he was a professional baker. And the guy said, I don't understand how you know that. The cop said this. And Oscar said, you know, this is the way that a professional, a master baker would do lettering on top of a cake. And it turns out that the suspect, the killer, actually, that's what his job was, is he was a professional baker. So I'll give you another example. It's like one of my favorite, I don't know if we have time for it, but it's not in the book, so it's kind of a little exclusive. It's one of my favorite cases, and it just didn't fit. It was one of those decisions you have to make where it just, forensically, it doesn't really fit. It's toxicology. That wasn't his specialty. You know, he did a good job on that part of the case. But so it's the case of Eva Rablin, it's just one of the most fabulous cases, I think. And so this is 1927, I think, Central California. She's married to a man named Carroll Rablin, and he has gone deaf from after World War I. And she marries him. She's kind of a mail order bride, I guess. I don't know if that's a correct term, but she's from Texas. I think they just had an arrangement. And they got married, and she liked to dance because he had lost his hearing and was hearing impaired. He did not care to dance. So he would take her to dances and just kind of wait outside. She would always bring him coffee and cookies. So they go to a dance and one night, and he's sitting in his car. She comes out and hands him a cup of coffee and some cookies. And within about 30 seconds, he's writhing in pain, and then he's dead, you know, in less than an hour. The police come, and it looks like he's been poisoned. So Carol's father hates Eva. He thinks she's a gold digger. So everybody looks at Eva, but there's zero proof. It's strychnine poisoning, but there's zero proof. There's no evidence that she bought it. You know, she says he was kind of on the edge and suicidal just from losing his hearing. He was having a really hard time. So that sort of chain of custody of evidence is what was in question. How do you prove that she put poison in the coffee and handed it to him? Because she said, I walked away. He could have put it in and done it right then and there, which is consequently, if you're going to take your life, probably strychnine is not the way to go. It's very, very painful. So Heinrich looks at all of the evidence. He does this toxicology report. He does it inside the mug, and you know, it proves it's strychnine. None of that was a big deal. But he said, how do we prove that she's the one who did it, right? How do we prove that it came in? So they re-interview the witnesses. And he talks to a witness and he says, what was the scene like? And he says, okay, so the coffee shop thing was over here where she got the coffee. Then there's the dance floor and then there's the door. So Heinrich says, so she got her coffee and the cookies and she walked across the dance floor. What was the dance floor like? Oh, everybody was everywhere. So he says she had to have bumped into somebody. He re-interviews everybody and a woman said she did. She bumped into me. She spilled coffee on my dress. The woman kept the dress and it came back with strychnine. And that was it. She confessed, and that was it. That's all it took. So I couldn't put that in the book because, it was more of his intuition that I find as impressive as any little test. I just wouldn't have thought that. I don't think I would have even come up with that for some reason. I don't know. I think that, for someone who I think about cases an awful lot, I have little blank spots in my head where that piece just won't come together for me, and it does for him. And that's what I found to be kind of impressive. So I don't actually remember what the original question was, but I love telling that story. I think it's a great story.
Well, and it shows there's a mix of kind of art and craft as well as the science. You need the science to back it up, but then it's also building that intuition of just being able to ask the right question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really why he was compared to Holmes. Is what was unique about Oscar was that he could walk into a crime scene and have 30 tests in his head, in his repertoire that he could run, and there just weren't. Everybody was a specialist. They still are. You have bloodstain pattern analysis specialists. You have ballistics experts. If you find someone hanging from a tree, they're probably not going to call a ballistics expert in. So Oscar was all of those things. He could go to a scene and just sort of go, okay, this is what I could run. This is what I can do to track down, a body, to figure out where a body was. There's a specific case that I'm thinking of where he used a grain of sand to locate a body that was 12 miles away from an original body part was found. Mm-hmm. And it was pretty extraordinary. And it was a test that really, because of one of his previous engineering jobs with the city of Tacoma, probably no other forensic scientist would have known how to do it. No one would have been capable of it. So it was very unique in that way.
Yeah. We have a question. Can you describe your writing schedule, where you are when you're writing, how long a stint at a time, how you keep going through the end, and what are the major forces that would cause you to stop prematurely, and how do you overcome them and keep on going until you're finished?
Let's see. Forces to stop me. There's no force that's going to stop me because I have 2 children and I have to keep going. So I write out of love. I would say 40% love, 60% fear, I would say, because it's one of my main jobs. And, my writing schedule can be erratic. I really hope that it's not. I try. I keep a to-do list, a Word document to-do list, and I have a word count. My friend got me this. Actually, it was my parents. I will write, you probably can't see this. Does it say? I will write 500 words. No, 500 more. Because I literally will get, I'm supposed to write, I was supposed to have written 900 words today. I didn't write any. I got derailed. So I'm going to try to write tonight. And then I have the added complication of I teach 3 classes each semester for about a total of 80 students. So I've got those to deal with, and I've got these 2 kids to deal with. And then I've got the podcast. I'm the editor on the podcast. So I do all of the edits that you hear on the podcast, I do myself.
Wow, really?
Yeah. So it's a lot. I mean, a lot of it is, I went to a coffee shop. As soon as we were able to open back up, I was immediately, the very first day my favorite coffee shop opened, I went back. And I was doing some really great writing on the book. And then I don't know what happened, but something changed and it was not the right environment. So one of my girls is at camp and the other one's at home. And she said, please don't go to the coffee shop. And so now I've been at home and I've been pretty successful exactly here where I am right now. But I do things like, hold on a second. It's like even right now, I have a little candle going, but I have a little oil lamp that I use to try to set the mood. I love really creepy things, Janet will tell you, Death in the Air, I try to make it as creepy as possible. If I could have a gas lamp in every room in my house and not burn our house down, I would absolutely do that. I love Victorian England. I love colonial America. I love sort of the spookiness and the shadows and fog and things jumping out at you. And so as much as I can recreate that, it really helps. I have watched every Jurassic Park movie probably about 75 times. And I play it in the background. It sounds so dumb, but it makes me feel like I can, because I know everything that's happening. I'm not entranced by it, but I also can look up every once in a while. So I'll play Jurassic Park, and especially the first one, Jurassic Park in the background. And it actually soothes me. It's kind of like white noise, and it keeps me grounded. It's a struggle, but you have to, as a journalist, I have never blown a deadline ever. Never, ever, ever. I've never asked for an extension. It's just, I can't do it as part of my job. And I know that ticks off other writers when I say that, like I'm setting up a bad precedent for them. But I have to stay on deadline. So I just push my way through it no matter what.
Mm-hmm. The same person wants to know, well, she said you're a successful writer, author, podcaster. You are. Can you say, if you had not become this, what or who would you have wished to become instead?
I probably would have gone to law school. My dad was a really great law professor, and he was amazing. And I went to his classes all the time. And I really I joined the clinic, the Innocence Project, after he died. So probably I would have been in law school. I actually looked into getting a master's. I have a master's in journalism, but I looked into a master's of forensic science because I just think it's so fascinating. But I think this is, I get the best of both worlds. I get to write about law and I get to write about forensics, and I have a lot of flexibility. So what's exciting to me is storytelling. I've had a friend of mine, he didn't mean anything negative by it, but he said, I don't understand why you're trying to do all of this. Why don't you just be the best something, be the best author, or be the best podcast, pick one. And then he later apologized, and I said, yeah, I'm not, but I'm just trying to be the best storyteller, and not every story fits with a book. Not like I was really convinced when I went to Virginia. We were in Virginia a couple of weeks ago. We went for 2 weeks, and we went to Williamsburg because there was a 1766 story that I loved. And I was pretty convinced it was a podcast. I knew it was going to be a podcast, but then I was convinced it was going to be a book. And then by the end of the trip, it turned out it wasn't a book because I had the right resources for the podcast. I have family, the contemporary family still around. I had all of these historians. There's a lot of great natural sound in colonial Williamsburg, which is perfect for a podcast. But for a book, I need like diaries, letters, journals, heart on the sleeve. Like I need that kind of depth. And so I'm just grateful that the first 2 seasons of Tenfold More Wicked were failed books. I mean, I had all of this research, years worth of research on those 2 stories, on Burke and Hare, the serial killers with the anatomy professor, and Edward Ruloff, the genius killer. I had so much research because they were meant to be books. I had written 50-page proposals on each one. So for me, just being a good storyteller and saying, I think this is a good story. Now, where does it go? I don't know if y'all know this. I was so impressed. Eric Larson, who is a great author, narrative nonfiction author, who wrote Devil in the White City, in the New York Times, I'm proud of him I think this was probably pretty brave for him. He decided to do a ghost story, a fictional ghost story. He's always been a narrative nonfiction writer, and it's for audio only. So it's like an Audible book only. So he's not releasing it. It's like a novelette or a novella. And it just shows that guy. I remember reading an article with him where he just said, I have zero interest in screenwriting. I don't want to do podcasting. I don't want to do anything but write books. But I think now even he sees the power of reaching an audience and just telling a good story. And there's now so many venues to do that. That's what's exciting for me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm a budding podcaster. I'm working on a podcast for the library. And one of the themes that keeps coming up is libraries have changed. We're not just books. We're about movies and magazines and ebooks and classes and lectures. And, I don't know that I would have heard of your books had I not been a fan of podcasts. And podcasts are so good at doing crossover episodes and connecting you with people that you maybe wouldn't have heard of. And I totally agree. Not every documentary could be a book. Not every book is, or, every story needs a different medium, I think. Yeah.
I agree.
We have a request, and we're going to wrap up soon. So if you have a comment or a question, go ahead and put it in there. And Anne would like you to just name the book one more time that you held up at the beginning, the red book.
Oh, Anne, don't you steal any of my book ideas. I'm pretty convinced that all my books are going to come out. It's called Blood Letters and Bad Men. And you could see how raggedy my copy is. It's really raggedy. But it's a good book. I really, and it comes with big pictures. And I've only made it to, I stopped once I found Oscar, honestly. I'm sure I'll go back to it, but it's pretty intense. It's a lot of gangsters, though, I will say, an awful lot of gangsters.
And what books or TV shows, what would you recommend? What are you watching right now?
Well, true crime, of course. Let's see, what am I watching right now that I think has been really good? Well, there are some excellent, if you like true crime, there are some excellent international true crime stories on Netflix. So a friend of mine, Eric Nuzum, made for Audible only, I think, made the story of, I'm going to butcher her name, Sophie de la Planete, I think is how you say her name, de la Planche. So she's a French woman who had a house in Ireland, in rural Ireland, in West Cork, and she was murdered. And it's a fascinating story. It's called Sophie on Netflix. And I was actually listening to it like I would a podcast. I turned the audio, it actually didn't annoy me as much as I thought it was going to, the English audio dub over so that I wouldn't, because I can't drive when I'm in Virginia. I didn't want to read the subtitles of all the French, but it's a fascinating story and I think it's really well done. Eric did the podcast, which was a huge hit, and now it's been converted to a documentary on Netflix, which has been really, really good. So I think that was really good. There are some other ones that I saw. Who Killed Little Gregory? It's a terrible title, but it's set, where was that set? France also. That was set in France. And it was a little boy who died, and just an incredible, this family had just been harassed by probably a member of their own family for years, and then their son goes missing and is killed. And I don't look so much for the subject matter, just how well done it is. And those two documentaries I thought were really, really well done. And I really enjoyed a lot. So I think those are the two. Tread, I would highly recommend Tread. I found it fascinating. It is a mad white man taking vengeance on other people. But because of the intimacy of the audio tapes, and to me, Tread is such a interesting commentary on why he was driven to do this. He took a bulldozer and converted it into a tank that he then just rolled over the entire town. Nobody could stop him. And his reasoning behind it, in a weird way, makes sense. And it's weird how the film does that. It was all terrible. He didn't kill anybody, but the property destruction was amazing. But I showed it to my daughter just because I thought the way that they told the story was really interesting. So those are the three. I also will confess a little bit that I don't know if you all remember the Fire Festival, FYRE.
Yes. Yes.
There's two documentaries, one on Hulu about it and one on Netflix, and they're both super entertaining. The Fire Festival was this sort of Coachella rich millennial festival that never really happened, and they were all ripped off. And it was, it was people who were paying $200,000 to go to the Bahamas. And both of those films, one on Hulu and one on Netflix, I thought they're so interesting and entertaining. I watched. So
yeah, we watched that as well, and it is just like, oh, what is wrong with these people? Yeah, it's fascinating.
It was interesting.
So I don't see any other questions, and I want to respect your time because I know you have to get back to writing. And
it's the kids, but writing. I think my writing's done for the day. I'm pretty sure.
Well, thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you.
This was so much fun. I looked forward to this. I had a great time. I look forward to your next book and more of your podcasts and just following whatever you do, because it's all so interesting.
Thank you. And I hope to be in Nantucket in person someday. I hope to see everybody in person. This has been great. So I really appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for everyone that came and your questions, and have a wonderful evening.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Kate.
Bye.